If you truly understand what lies behind synchronicity, you'll never be able to look at the events of your own life the same way again, because what you call coincidence may be exactly the point where reality and your mind meet, and ignoring that comes at a steep cost, a very steep cost, because it means living completely blind inside your own existence. How many things have happened to you that felt strangely aligned? How many times have you thought of someone and that person appeared, heard the exact sentence you needed at the right moment, found a piece of information at the precise instant your life was about to change? The problem is that almost everyone ignores this, discards it, calls it chance, because facing the possibility that events carry real meaning is simply too uncomfortable. Ancient Hermeticism always treated reality as something structured by intelligence, not as absurd chaos. And when you begin to look at your life through that lens, something profoundly unsettling happens. You start to notice patterns that were there the whole time. And when those patterns begin to show themselves, the question stops being, is this a coincidence? And becomes something far more disturbing. Why is this happening to me right now? There's a logic behind it. There's a real mechanism. And when you understand that mechanism, you start to perceive something almost impossible to ignore. That certain events in your life seem to respond to what is happening inside you. And if you keep paying attention, if you keep investigating all the way to the end, something very uncomfortable begins to happen. You begin to realize that reality may be speaking to you all the time. Now pay attention with brutal honesty. How many times has something happened in your life at the exact moment you needed it? Not after, not before, at the exact moment. Have you noticed that? An unexpected meeting. A sentence someone said without knowing it would completely change your perspective. A book that appeared at the precise moment you were looking for answers. A video, a conversation, a symbol, an apparently small event that completely shifts the course of a decision. Now answer with brutal honesty. Has that never happened to you? Or has it happened so many times that you simply decided to stop paying attention? Because this is where the central issue of synchronicity begins. It's not about cheap mysticism. It's not about superstition. It's about meaning emerging in events. Synchronicity means exactly that. Events that connect through meaning, not necessarily through direct physical cause. Now think about that deeply. You live in a universe where billions of things happen at the same time. Billions. But some of those things seem to touch your life directly your mind, directly the moment you're living. Why? Why do certain events seem perfectly fitted to the moment of your life? Why do certain people appear exactly when you're going through an inner transformation? Why do certain events seem to press precisely on the point where you need to change? This is not a small question. This is a gigantic question. And ancient Hermeticism always dealt with this question with extreme seriousness. In the text of the Corpus Hermeticum, reality is described as something profoundly connected to mind, not in the modern psychological sense, but in the metaphysical sense. Reality is not treated as a set of dead objects. It is treated as something permeated by intelligence. Now think about the impact of that. If reality possesses structural intelligence, then events can carry meaning. Now take a deep breath and think about your own life. How many times have you lived through something that felt like an invisible push, a situation that pinned you against the wall, a decision you were practically forced to make, an encounter that opened a door you never imagined, and then you look back and you realize that moment changed everything. Everything. Now I'm going to ask you an uncomfortable question. What if those moments aren't rare? What if those moments are part of the normal structure of reality? What if your life is full of these points of alignment, but you simply never learn to recognize them? Because synchronicity is not just strange things happening. Synchronicity is when an external event seems to respond directly to an internal state. That is the central point. Pay attention to that. You begin to think deeply about a topic. Days later, you run into that exact topic in several different places. You begin to question your life. Suddenly, people, conversations, and events appear that press on that very question. You fall into an inner crisis. Soon after, events arise that force you to confront that crisis. Now think about it. Why does this happen? Why do certain events seem to align perfectly with inner processes of your mind? This is exactly the point where many people panic. Because if this is real, then reality is not just something that happens to you. It may be happening in dialogue with you. Now hold that idea for a moment, because it changes everything. If reality responds, then living unconsciously stops being neutral. Ignoring patterns stops being neutral. Ignoring meaningful events stops being neutral. Because you may be ignoring signals. Now pay attention to something extremely simple. Have you noticed how certain kinds of events keep repeating in your life? The same kinds of problems, the same kinds of encounters, the same kinds of challenges. This happens to a lot of people, and almost no one asks why. People just say, it's bad luck, that's life. It's a coincidence. But what if it isn't? What if those events are appearing exactly because there is something inside you that still hasn't changed? Now think about that deeply. If your life were a feedback system, what would those events be trying to show you? If certain events keep coming back, what exactly are they trying to press inside you? Now look at your own story. Which events returned again and again? Which patterns have you already noticed? Which situations seem to appear repeatedly until something inside you changes? Because this is where synchronicity stops being curiosity. It becomes confrontation. It confronts you. It presses you. It places situations in front of you that reveal exactly where you are internally. Now think about that with brutal honesty. How many times has life put something in front of you and you simply ignored it? How many times did an encounter bring an opportunity and you didn't have the courage to follow it? How many times did an event make it clear you needed to change something and you decided to remain exactly the same? Now comes the most unsettling question of all. What if reality keeps placing those situations in front of you until you finally pay attention? What if the events of your life aren't just random happenings, but points of contact between you and a larger structure of reality? What if the coincidences you ignored were exactly the moments when something was trying to get your attention? Now think about that deeply, because when you begin to perceive true synchronicities, something strange happens. Reality begins to feel different. Events begin to feel less random. Encounters begin to feel less accidental. And certain happenings begin to feel almost precise, almost as if they were waiting for the exact right moment to occur. Now I'm going to ask you a question that almost no one has the courage to face. If your life really is full of these points of alignment, if these moments of coincidence carry real meaning, if certain events seem to respond to what's happening inside you, then there is a question that changes everything. A question that can be extremely uncomfortable. A question few people can endure. If reality can respond, then why is it responding exactly to you? And what if some events in your life aren't merely events, but messages disguised inside reality itself? And what if some happenings in your life aren't merely events, but messages disguised within reality itself? Now stop for a second and be brutally honest with yourself. How many times have you noticed something strange unfolding and simply pretended you didn't see it? How many times did an event coincide perfectly with something happening inside your mind? You think about changing your life and suddenly the exact opportunity appears, one that seemed impossible. You start doubting the path you're on, and almost immediately a situation arises that forces you to face that doubt head on. This is not a comfortable idea, because if these events carry real meaning, then living distracted stops being an innocent habit and becomes a form of voluntary blindness. Hermeticism has always treated the universe as intelligible, something that can be read, something that can be understood. And that doesn't mean every tiny detail is a mystical sign. It means certain events carry an intensity of meaning that becomes impossible to ignore once you're truly paying attention. Now imagine for a moment that your entire life is made of moments of invisible alignment. Moments where what is happening within you meets something happening outside you. Think of the instant you made an important decision, and soon after, an event appeared that either confirmed that decision or shattered it completely. Think of moments when you were lost, and suddenly something happened that brought unexpected clarity. It wasn't a long logical explanation. It wasn't a complex philosophical argument. It was a simple occurrence that struck directly at the center of your experience. That is what makes synchronicity so unsettling. It doesn't show up as theory, it shows up as event. Something happens and you immediately feel that it carries meaning. It isn't a slow, laborious, rational deduction. It's a direct perception of sense. And that direct perception is exactly where many people get frightened and retreat. Because accepting the existence of synchronicity means accepting that reality may possess layers of meaning the ordinary rational mind cannot fully explain. Ancient Hermeticism did not deny reason, but it also never reduced reality only to what can be explained mechanically. When Hermetic texts speak of cosmic mind or universal intelligence, they are not describing an anthropomorphic entity sending personalized signals to each person. What is being described is a structure in which consciousness and reality are not completely separate. And if that structure exists, then events can emerge in ways that seem to respond directly to someone's inner experience. Now think deeply about that. If mind and reality are not fully separate, then moments of alignment between thought and happening stop being impossible. How many times have you thought intensely about something and soon afterward encountered that very thing in the world? Maybe you were searching for an answer and someone mentioned exactly the theme that had been moving through your mind. Maybe you were reflecting on a decision and suddenly a situation appeared that clearly exposed the consequences of that decision. The point here is not to say that every thought immediately creates external events. That would be a dangerous, superficial simplification. The point is to recognize that there are specific moments in which thought, emotional state, and external happenings seem to align with extraordinary precision. These moments are rare enough to feel exceptional, yet common enough that nearly anyone can recall a few examples from their own life. Now consider something even more uncomfortable. What if these moments of alignment are not completely random? What if there are specific inner conditions that make synchronicities more likely? Think of periods in your life when you were intensely attentive, intensely present, intensely questioning. Many people report that it's precisely in those moments that synchronicities begin to appear more frequently. When someone starts investigating their own life with depth, when someone begins asking real questions about the meaning of their existence, something strange seems to happen. Events begin to answer those questions in unexpected ways, not as clear, orderly replies, but as encounters, situations, symbols, and occurrences that push the person towards certain realizations. This raises a massive question. Is synchronicity simply something that is always happening but usually goes unnoticed? Or is there something in the person's very state of consciousness that influences how these events emerge? Hermeticism has always suggested that consciousness and reality are intertwined at very deep levels. That doesn't mean the individual human mind controls the universe. It means mind and cosmos may share common structures. If that is true, then synchronicity would be the moment when those structures briefly align. It isn't that the universe is sending a personal message, it's that two layers of reality meet at a specific point. Now return to your own story. Think of a moment when something happened and you immediately felt it mattered. Not because someone explained it to you, but because the event itself carried a clear symbolic weight. Maybe it was an unexpected encounter. Maybe it was something seemingly small that unleashed an enormous change. These moments have a very specific quality. They feel inevitable when you look back. After they happen, it becomes almost impossible to imagine life taking the exact same path without that event. And it is precisely this feeling of retrospective inevitability that makes synchronicity so intriguing. Now imagine how many of these moments may have slipped past, unnoticed across your life. How many times did something significant happen while you were too distracted to perceive it? How many times could an encounter have become something important, but you were too busy looking in another direction? Most people live in a constant state of distraction. The mind is always occupied with worries, plans, fears, and expectations. In that mental state, even potentially meaningful events pass unseen. They happen, but they aren't recognized as part of a larger pattern. But when someone starts paying real attention, the experience changes completely. The person begins to notice connections that once seemed invisible. An encounter links to an idea that arose days earlier. A decision links to an event that seemed insignificant when it occurred. Gradually, life begins to feel less fragmented. Events that once seemed isolated begin forming a coherent sequence. This does not mean everything becomes predictable or controllable. On the contrary, reality remains profoundly mysterious, but that mystery begins to carry a structure. That structure is precisely what ancient Hermeticism always tried to point toward. Not as a closed system of answers, but as a way of perceiving reality more deeply. When Hermetic texts speak of true knowledge, they are not referring merely to accumulating information. They are referring to a change in how someone perceives the world. A shift in which reality stops appearing as a set of disconnected events and begins to resemble a field of living relations between mind, experience, and occurrence. Now, imagine living while paying attention to these points of connection. Imagine noticing when certain events appear at the exact moment you're facing an important inner question. Imagine recognizing when certain encounters arise precisely when you're ready to understand something new. Little by little, you begin to notice that reality seems to respond in extremely subtle ways, not with direct answers, but with occurrences that provoke perception. And this is where many people begin to feel fear. Because if synchronicity is real, then life is not merely something that happens at random. It means ignoring certain events can have real consequences. It means certain opportunities may appear only once. It means certain encounters may be turning points that determine the direction of decades of your life. That possibility is frightening because it implies responsibility. It implies paying attention. Now think deeply. What if some of the most important decisions of your life were already influenced by moments of synchronicity you barely noticed? What if certain paths you followed began with a seemingly small encounter that ended up changing everything? When you look back carefully, many life stories reveal exactly this kind of pattern. A casual conversation leads to a friendship. A friendship leads to an opportunity. An opportunity leads to a complete change of direction. What's most striking is that these chains rarely feel planned in the moment they occur. They feel accidental. But when you observe the full sequence, a strange sense of coherence emerges, as if each event occupied a specific place within a much larger chain of happenings. And that brings us back again to the central question. Are we really dealing with purely random coincidences? Now imagine you begin living with this question constantly present, not as paranoia, not as superstition, but as investigation. Each time something strange happens, you observe. Each time an encounter feels charged with meaning, you pay attention. Each time an event seems to align perfectly with something happening inside you, you analyze it carefully. Slowly, something begins to change in how you perceive your own life. You begin to notice that certain moments have far greater symbolic density than others. Some events simply happen and disappear. Others leave a deep mark, as if they were points of inflection. And when you connect several of these points of inflection, a kind of invisible map of your own trajectory begins to emerge, a map that was not drawn in advance, but that reveals itself gradually through the sequence of events. Now pause and ask yourself an extremely simple question. If synchronicity is a real feature of human experience, why does almost no one talk seriously about it? Why do most people prefer to treat these events as strange curiosities instead of investigating them deeply? Perhaps because facing this possibility demands a radical change in how we see reality. And that change inevitably leads to another, far more unsettling question. If certain happenings in your life carry meaning beyond purely mechanical explanation, then perhaps reality itself is operating at levels far deeper than what we perceive in daily life. And if that is true, then there is something even more disturbing hidden behind synchronicity, something that does not limit itself to meaningful coincidences alone, something that could reveal that the very structure of reality is far more conscious than we imagine. Because if the very structure of reality is more conscious than we imagine, then the question stops being merely, why do coincidences happen? And becomes something far more uncomfortable. Why do they happen to you at the exact moment of your life? Think about that with brutal honesty. Among billions of possible events, why do certain happenings seem to strike directly at the center of your experience? You're living your normal routine, and then, suddenly, something happens that pierces your perception like an arrow. It isn't just an external event. It's as if that moment was designed to hit the exact point where you are, psychologically, emotionally, existentially. That is what makes synchronicity so disturbing. It doesn't appear merely as statistical coincidence. It appears as coincidence saturated with lived meaning, something that touches the inner state of the one experiencing it. Now consider something even deeper. Synchronicity isn't only an isolated event. Often it happens in sequences. One event leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. At first, it looks like a small coincidence, then another appears, and then another. And suddenly you realize you're inside a chain of strangely connected events. This happens to more people than you think. People begin investigating a specific theme, and in the following weeks, that same theme starts showing up repeatedly in different places. Conversations, books, encounters, ideas, symbols, as if reality were echoing something that began inside that person's mind. That kind of sequence is exactly what makes synchronicity impossible to ignore once someone truly decides to pay attention. Now imagine the implication of that. If events can form meaningful chains, then each happening can function as a point of bifurcation, a point where life can head in completely different directions, depending on how you respond. Think of moments in your life when an apparently small decision ended up shaping years of your future. Maybe you chose to accept an invitation. Maybe you decided to speak with someone you would normally ignore. Maybe you followed a strange curiosity that appeared out of nowhere. In the moment, it felt trivial. But looking back, you realize that moment opened a door that completely changed the path of your existence. And many times, those moments begin with what looks like an insignificant coincidence. Now think of how many doors may have appeared in front of you throughout your life. How many opportunities arrived disguised as casual encounters? How many ideas surfaced at seemingly random moments? How many times did something call for your attention, but you chose to ignore it because it felt too unlikely or too strange? Most people live reacting only to what is immediately obvious, but synchronicity rarely presents itself as obvious. It shows up as a subtle possibility, something that requires attention to be perceived. It demands sensitivity, it demands presence, and when someone is completely distracted, those moments simply pass by unrecognized. Now notice something interesting. Many accounts of synchronicity occur during transitional periods in people's lives, moments of crisis, change, deep questioning, when someone begins to doubt the direction they're taking, when someone begins to search for deeper answers. Something strange seems to happen. Events begin to organize themselves in unexpected ways around those inner questions, not as ready-made answers, but as experiences that push the person toward new perceptions. This raises an intriguing question. Do moments of interchange make people more sensitive to these patterns? If that's true, then synchronicity wouldn't be only an external phenomenon. It would be linked as well to the inner state of the one who perceives it. People in more attentive states of consciousness may recognize patterns that go completely unnoticed by those living on autopilot. That doesn't mean they are magically creating these events. It means they are noticing connections that were previously hidden by distraction. Reality doesn't necessarily change. What changes is the way it is perceived. Now think about that deeply. Most of our everyday perception is extremely limited. The human brain constantly filters information to prevent overload. Millions of stimuli happen around us, but only a few reach consciousness. That means most of what happens in the world goes entirely unnoticed. Now imagine that some of those filtered stimuli could reveal meaningful patterns if they were perceived. How many invisible connections might exist between events we simply fail to notice? When someone begins to pay real attention, something curious happens. The world feels richer with meaning, not because the person is inventing meaning, but because they begin to notice relationships that were previously invisible. A conversation connects to a thought that arose days earlier. A symbol appears repeatedly across different contexts. A casual encounter reveals information that seems to fit perfectly into an old question. Little by little, reality begins to feel less random. But there is a danger here, too. The human mind has a natural tendency to look for patterns, even where none exist. That's why any serious investigation of synchronicity has to maintain an extremely careful stance. This isn't about believing everything is a sign or a message. That would quickly lead to interpretive delusion. The central point of synchronicity is not to turn every small event into a cosmic revelation. The point is to recognize that certain specific events seem to carry an unusual intensity of meaning. These events usually have clear characteristics. They occur at psychologically relevant moments. They seem to connect directly with something that was happening internally for the person. And they often produce an immediate sense of meaning that doesn't depend on forced interpretation. It's as if the happening itself carries the meaning within it. That sensation is difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced it, but anyone who has lived through a moment like this immediately recognizes what is being described. Now consider something even deeper. What if synchronicity is only the surface of a much larger phenomenon? What if these moments are only small glimpses of a deeper structure in which consciousness and reality are intertwined? Many philosophers and mystics throughout history suggested exactly that. The idea that mind and world are not completely separate may sound radical, but it appears in many ancient traditions and even in some modern interpretations of consciousness. If that interconnection exists, then moments of synchronicity would be moments when that connection becomes visible, not as definitive scientific proof, but as a direct experience of alignment between inner and outer. These moments can function like small windows through which reality reveals something about its own structure. Not complete answers, but clues. Now imagine the psychological impact of living while recognizing these moments. Life stops feeling like a mere sequence of random happenings. It begins to feel like an emergent narrative, something unfolding through encounters and meaningful events. That doesn't mean everything is planned or predetermined. It only means certain moments carry real symbolic weight within a person's trajectory. And when someone begins to recognize that, a new kind of attention arises. The person starts observing their own life as if reading a complex text. Each happening may carry layers of meaning. Each encounter may open new possibilities. Each decision may completely alter the sequence of future events. This perception doesn't make life more predictable, but it makes experience far more intense. Now, return to the question we began with. What does it really mean when something seemingly impossible happens at the exact moment of your life? Are we dealing with simple statistical coincidences or something deeper? The truth is that no one has a definitive answer to that question. But ignoring the possibility of meaning altogether may be a form of blindness as great as blindly believing any interpretation. And it's precisely in that space between skepticism and openness that real investigation begins. A space where you don't accept easy explanations, but you also don't dismiss profound experiences. A space where you observe your own life with radical attention. And when someone truly begins doing that, something curious happens. Certain events begin to feel less and less random. And then the most disturbing question of all arises. If synchronicity really reveals something about the relationship between consciousness and reality, then perhaps these moments aren't only meaningful coincidences. Perhaps they are clues that something much larger is unfolding behind the very structure of existence. Perhaps they are clues to something much larger unfolding behind the very structure of existence. Now pause for a moment and face that possibility without running from it. What if reality is not merely a stage where events accumulate at random, but a living field where meaning can emerge when certain conditions align? Think about what that would imply for your own life. It would mean that some moments are not just ordinary occurrences, but points of revelation where something deeper becomes visible for a few seconds. Not as a complete explanation of the universe, but as a brief fissure in the fabric of everyday reality. Something happens, you notice it, and for an instant, the feeling that an invisible order exists passes through your experience. Most people feel this and quickly ignore it, because the ordinary mind prefers the comfort of simple explanations. But what if those moments are precisely the instance when reality shows a fragment of its deeper structure? Now imagine how many times these fragments may have appeared in your life without you noticing. How many seemingly mundane situations might hide a greater meaning if they were observed more carefully? Think about conversations that seemed casual, but days later revealed an essential piece of information. Think about unexpected encounters that appeared exactly when you were facing an important decision. These events rarely seem extraordinary in the moment they occur. They appear small, almost invisible. But as time passes, when you look back, you realize that instant marked the beginning of an entire sequence of transformations. Synchronicity often reveals itself only in retrospect, when you notice that a whole chain of events began with a single moment that seemed trivial. This retrospective perception is extremely intriguing. At the instant the event occurs, it may seem like nothing more than a curious coincidence, but years later, when you observe the full trajectory of your life, that moment gains an entirely different weight. It becomes a turning point. Something that seemed small reveals itself as the beginning of a much larger process. This raises an unavoidable question. How many of these turning points exist scattered throughout our existence? How many events that seem insignificant today may reveal enormous meaning when viewed from the distance of time? Now think about how human memory works. Our minds tend to organize experiences into coherent narratives. When we look back, we try to find connections between events that once seemed isolated. This can lead some to argue that synchronicity is merely a psychological construction, a way of giving meaning to random events after they have already happened. That hypothesis deserves to be taken seriously. But even if part of the experience of synchronicity involves human interpretation, that does not eliminate the phenomenon itself. The fact that certain events seem to fit together in extraordinarily meaningful ways remains something worth investigating. Imagine two possibilities. In the first, all these happenings are merely statistical coincidences, and the human mind is simply projecting meaning onto them. In the second possibility, there exists some real level of connection between internal states of consciousness and external events. Neither of these possibilities can be easily dismissed. Both raise deep questions about the nature of reality and the mind. And perhaps the most interesting thing is that these two perspectives do not have to be completely opposed. Part of the phenomenon may be psychological, and part may be structural. Now consider something even more fascinating. The very way we perceive time may influence how we understand synchronicity. Everyday experience makes us feel that time flows linearly, like a sequence of separate moments. But many philosophical traditions have suggested that this linear perception may be only a simplification created by the human mind. If time has a more complex structure than we imagine, then events that appear separate might actually be connected at deeper levels of reality. This idea may seem abstract, but think about how certain experiences in life seem to challenge the simple linearity of time. Sometimes a present event seems to answer a question you asked years earlier. Sometimes a decision made today reveals a meaning that only becomes clear much later. It is as if different moments of life communicate with one another through an invisible network of relationships, not as direct causality, but as resonance between events. If such a network of relationships exists, then synchronicity could be understood as moments when that network becomes visible. Small points where hidden connections between events temporarily emerge into conscious experience. These moments do not need to happen frequently in order to be meaningful. Even a few episodes across an entire lifetime may be enough to completely change how someone perceives the world. Now think about the psychological effect of recognizing these moments. When someone realizes that certain events carry deep meaning, their attitude toward life itself begins to change. The person may start observing their experiences with more attention, more curiosity, more sensitivity. That does not mean living in a constant state of mystical expectation. It simply means recognizing that reality may be richer and more complex than what we perceive on the surface. This shift in perception can also generate a new form of responsibility. If certain events truly carry unique opportunities for transformation, then ignoring them may mean losing important moments in one's own trajectory. That does not mean every decision must be made with fear of making a mistake. Life remains full of uncertainty, but it does mean recognizing that some moments may possess a density of meaning that deserves special attention. Now imagine what it would be like to live while paying attention to those moments. Imagine waking up every day with the awareness that certain events might reveal something essential about the path you're following. This attitude does not turn life into a permanent riddle, but into an ongoing investigation. Every encounter can be a possibility for learning. Every event may carry a clue about something that has not yet been understood. This investigative attitude is profoundly different from simply believing in signs or completely denying any meaning. It is a posture of conscious observation. Instead of accepting simplistic explanations, you observe, question, compare experiences, and analyze patterns over time. Gradually, life itself becomes a field of study, and perhaps that is exactly what makes synchronicity so fascinating. It invites us to look at reality more deeply. It forces us to question whether the world is truly just a collection of random events, or whether there exists some level of order that we do not yet fully understand. This question has no definitive answer, but the investigation itself can already transform the way we live. Now think about the impact of that investigation over decades. A person who spends life completely ignoring any possibility of meaning in events may live very differently from someone who attentively observes the connections between happenings. This is not about superstition, but about sensitivity to the complexity of human experience. And when that sensitivity develops, something curious happens. Reality begins to feel less mechanical and more dynamic. Life stops being merely a sequence of predictable events and begins to be perceived as a process full of unexpected encounters, emerging possibilities, and surprising connections. At that point, the initial question returns with even greater force. What does it truly mean when something happens at the exact moment you needed to perceive something important? Are we merely observing extraordinary coincidences, or do these moments reveal something essential about the way consciousness and reality interact? Perhaps we may never answer that question definitively, but the very existence of these experiences already suggests that the relationship between mind and world may be far deeper than the superficial explanation of pure chance. And if that is true, then each moment of synchronicity can be seen as a small opening through which reality reveals a fragment of its own depth. And when someone begins to notice these openings repeatedly throughout life, one final unsettling question inevitably arises. If these moments truly point towards something deeper, then perhaps synchronicity is not merely a psychological curiosity. Perhaps it is a sign that reality itself possesses layers of meaning we are only beginning to perceive. Perhaps it is a sign that reality itself contains layers of meaning we are only beginning to perceive. Now think about this calmly, without avoiding the question that naturally arises when someone observes these phenomena carefully. If there are layers of meaning in reality, why do they appear only at certain specific moments? Why don't we perceive this kind of alignment all the time? The answer may lie in the very functioning of the human mind. Much of our daily perception is occupied with automatic tasks, immediate concerns, and repetitive routines. In that mental state, even events filled with meaning can pass completely unnoticed. It's as if we were walking along a path full of important signs while looking only at the ground. Now imagine what happens when someone begins to slow down this automatic perception. When a person starts observing more carefully what happens around them, the field of perception expands. Things that once seemed disconnected begin to form unexpected relationships. A thought that appeared in the morning connects with something that happens in the afternoon. A question that arose during a walk finds a clue in a casual conversation. These small alignments begin to form a kind of invisible network of connections between events. This network of connections may not be obvious at the moment events occur, but over time it begins to reveal itself. The person notices that certain themes keep returning in different contexts. Similar ideas appear in unexpected places. Situations that seem unrelated end up leading to similar reflections. Gradually, a feeling emerges that life is trying to show something through the repetition of these patterns. This repetition is one of the most intriguing aspects of synchronicity. It's not just about a single event that appears meaningful. Often, the same kind of coincidence appears multiple times across different periods of life. A symbol that emerges repeatedly in distinct contexts. A specific type of encounter that seems to occur at crucial moments. A theme that returns constantly through books, conversations, and experiences. This repetition creates an impression of continuity, as if reality were reinforcing something that has not yet been fully understood. Now think about the psychological impact of perceiving these repetitions. A person begins to feel that there is a kind of silent dialogue between their inner experience and the world around them. Not a literal dialogue, but a sequence of indirect responses appearing through events. A doubt arises in the mind, and sometime later, an external situation seems to illuminate that doubt in an unexpected way. This raises an important question. Could synchronicity function as a kind of mirror between inner and outer reality? Perhaps certain events reveal something about a person's internal state at the moment they occur. An unexpected encounter might reflect an openness that was already emerging within the mind. An opportunity might appear exactly when someone is ready to perceive it. In this sense, synchronicity would not be a magical event, but a complex interaction between perception, consciousness, and circumstances. When someone begins to observe this kind of interaction, life gains a different dimension. Small happenings stop being mere insignificant details. They become possible indicators of something unfolding at a deeper level of experience. Not because every event is extraordinary, but because some moments seem to condense meaning with remarkable intensity. This intensity of meaning is difficult to explain to someone who has never experienced something similar. It isn't a rational interpretation constructed after the event. It is an immediate perception that the moment carries a special weight. Something happens, and instantly the feeling arises that this is not just another ordinary event. That perception may last only a few seconds, but it often leaves a lasting mark in memory. Over time, these experiences begin to form a kind of map of one's own life trajectory. Each meaningful moment connects with other similar moments, creating a sequence of points that reveal the evolution of a personal story. Interestingly, this map is rarely visible while we are living through the events. It becomes clearer when we look back and observe the path that has been traveled. This retrospective vision can completely transform how someone interprets their own history. Events that once seemed random begin to look like stages of a larger process. Decisions that once felt impulsive reveal themselves as responses to circumstances that had been building for a long time. Encounters that once appeared to be simple coincidences become turning points in a broader narrative. When this perception becomes clear, an inevitable question arises. How many of these turning points are still ahead? If life has already revealed several moments of synchronicity in the past, it is reasonable to imagine that other similar moments may emerge in the future. This possibility creates an attitude of constant attention, a willingness to carefully observe what is happening in the present. This attention does not mean living in constant expectation of signs. It simply means remaining open to recognizing when something truly meaningful occurs. Instead of immediately dismissing these moments as mere coincidences, a person allows them to be examined more deeply. This investigation can reveal unexpected connections between events that initially appeared independent. As this investigation continues, the very notion of chance begins to be questioned, not in the sense of completely denying randomness in the world, but in recognizing that human experience may reveal patterns that go beyond simple accident. These patterns are not necessarily predictable, but they can become recognizable when observed over time. This prolonged observation can also bring a new understanding of the role of consciousness in the experience of reality. If certain events seem to respond meaningfully to a person's internal state, then perhaps consciousness is not merely a passive spectator of the universe. Perhaps it participates in some way in how certain events become relevant within experience. This idea does not need to be understood as direct control over the external world. Instead, it can be seen as a complex interaction where perception, attention, and circumstances meet at specific moments. In those moments, reality seems to reveal something that normally remains hidden. These revelations may be subtle, almost imperceptible to those who are not attentive, but for someone who observes carefully, they can become increasingly clear over time. Each new experience of synchronicity reinforces the feeling that reality contains layers of meaning that go beyond the superficial appearance of events. And the more someone explores these layers, the more questions arise. Questions about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between mind and world, about the possibility that reality is far more interconnected than we imagine. These questions do not have easy answers, but they open pathways for a deep investigation into the very experience of being alive. Perhaps that is exactly what makes synchronicity so fascinating. It does not provide definitive answers, but it creates questions that completely transform how we look at life. Each meaningful coincidence becomes an invitation to observe reality with greater attention, greater curiosity, and greater openness to the mystery that surrounds existence. And when someone accepts that invitation and begins to investigate their own life in this way, something extraordinary can happen. Reality stops appearing as an indifferent backdrop and begins to reveal a richness of invisible connections that were present all along, waiting only for someone attentive enough to notice them. And when someone begins to perceive these invisible connections, something changes profoundly in the way life itself is experienced. The world stops appearing as merely a sequence of independent events and begins to reveal a kind of continuity that was previously hidden. Small occurrences start to feel like part of a larger flow, as if each moment were connected to the next through a logic we still do not fully understand. It is not a mechanical logic like that of a predictable machine, but a logic of relationships. A thought leads to an encounter, the encounter leads to a decision, the decision leads to a change that completely alters the trajectory of life. When we observe this chain of events carefully, the feeling emerges that reality possesses a depth that normally goes unnoticed. This depth becomes especially visible when we look at time from a broader perspective. In everyday life, events seem isolated because we are trapped within the immediate moment. But when someone observes entire years of their own life, the perspective changes. Certain events begin to connect as if they were chapters of the same story. A decision made years earlier starts to make sense only much later. An apparently casual encounter reveals itself as the beginning of a sequence of events that completely transform someone's life. These chains are not always obvious when they occur, but they become clear when viewed with the distance that time provides. This phenomenon can generate a curious sense of retrospective coherence. Looking back, the trajectory of life appears more organized than it seemed while it was being lived. That does not mean everything was planned or predetermined. It simply means that certain events have a tendency to fit into patterns that only become visible afterward. This perception can completely transform how someone interprets their own past. Events that once seemed random begin to appear as part of a larger process of personal transformation. When this shift in perspective happens, the very notion of chance begins to be questioned. Not because chance stops existing, but because human experience reveals something that appears to go beyond pure randomness. Synchronicity appears exactly at this intersection between chance and meaning. It is the moment when an apparently random event coincides perfectly with a significant inner situation. This coincidence between inner and outer creates the impression that some deeper relationship exists between consciousness and reality. This relationship may not be fully understood, but its presence is difficult to ignore when someone observes their own life carefully. Moments of synchronicity tend to remain in memory with special intensity. Years later, a person can still remember exactly where they were, what they were thinking, and what happened at that instant. This clarity in memory suggests that these events possess an emotional and cognitive density different from most everyday experiences. This density of meaning can completely transform how someone perceives the present. Instead of living each moment as something isolated, the person begins to perceive the present as part of a continuous flow of interconnected events. Every decision becomes potentially meaningful because it may influence the sequence of events that will follow. Every encounter may open possibilities that are not yet visible in the moment. This perception can generate a special kind of attention. A person begins observing the details of their own experience more carefully. Conversations that seem trivial may reveal important ideas. Unexpected situations may bring insights that would not emerge otherwise. Gradually, reality begins to feel richer in possibilities than it once seemed. This richness of possibilities can also awaken a constant sense of curiosity. Instead of assuming that everything is either predictable or completely random, the person begins investigating events with greater openness. Each occurrence becomes an opportunity to observe how reality responds to the circumstances of everyday life. This investigation does not turn the world into a permanent puzzle, but into a field of observation where new connections may appear. Over time, this investigative attitude can lead to a deeper understanding of human experience itself. A person begins to realize that their life is not only a sequence of external events, but also a process of internal interpretation of those events. The meaning of an event lies not only in what happens, but also in how it is perceived and integrated into the personal narrative of the one who experiences it. This integration between event and interpretation is fundamental for understanding the impact of synchronicity. Two individuals may experience the same event, yet only one perceives a meaningful connection with something happening internally. This suggests that the experience of synchronicity involves both external factors and the perceptive capacity of the person living the moment. When this capacity for perception develops, life itself may begin to resemble a silent dialogue between inner and outer reality. Ideas arise in the mind and, sometime later, find unexpected reflections in the surrounding world. External situations provoke internal reflections that lead to new decisions. This continuous cycle of mutual influence creates a sense of active participation in one's own life trajectory. This sense of participation can bring a new feeling of responsibility. If certain moments possess the potential to transform the course of life, then paying attention to those moments becomes something valuable. Completely ignoring the connections between events may mean missing important opportunities for learning or change. But this responsibility does not need to be lived with anxiety. Synchronicity does not demand that someone interpret every small detail of reality as a sign. On the contrary, it seems to arise spontaneously in specific moments when the connection between events becomes evident on its own. The person's role is simply to maintain the sensitivity necessary to recognize those moments when they appear. Over the years, many people who reflect deeply on their experiences begin to notice that some of the most important moments of their lives began with unexpected coincidences. A casual encounter, a decision taken out of curiosity, an apparently small event that triggered enormous changes. These moments show how life can transform itself through occurrences that initially seem insignificant. This realization can lead to a more humble view of existence. Instead of believing that everything is either completely under control or completely beyond control, a person begins to recognize that life involves a complex combination of conscious choices and unexpected events. Synchronicity appears precisely within that intermediate space where decisions and coincidences meet. When someone learns to recognize that intermediate space, reality begins to reveal a level of complexity that previously seemed invisible. Life stops being perceived merely as a sequence of simple causes and effects, and starts to be seen as a network of relationships constantly transforming. This network of relationships can continue expanding throughout an entire lifetime. New encounters, new ideas, and new experiences keep emerging, each carrying the potential to connect with previous events in unexpected ways. In this way, a person's own life trajectory becomes an ongoing process of discovery. And the more someone becomes involved in this process of discovery, the more evident a question becomes, one that remains open at the center of this entire investigation. If certain events in life reveal connections that seem to go beyond simple coincidence, then perhaps synchronicity is not merely a curious phenomenon of human experience. Perhaps it is a clue that the relationship between consciousness and reality is far deeper than we normally manage to perceive. Now think with brutal honesty about everything you have just heard. If synchronicity is only coincidence, then your entire life is nothing more than a blind sequence of events with no real connection. But if some events carry deep meaning, such as impossible encounters, moments that change everything, and coincidences that seem to respond exactly to what you are experiencing, then ignoring them may mean living your entire life without noticing the most important moments of your own existence. Hermeticism has always pointed to something unsettling. Reality is not merely something that happens outside of you. There exists a deep relationship between consciousness and experience, and when certain events align with internal states of the mind, something extremely rare happens. The fabric of life seems to reveal a clue about the very structure of reality. The question now is not whether coincidences exist. The question is, how many of them have you ignored until today? Because perhaps some of the most important moments of your life have passed unnoticed, simply because you were not looking carefully enough. And if that is true, how many of those moments are still yet to come? Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a coincidence so absurd that it seemed impossible to be mere chance? Write yes or no in the comments and briefly share what happened. These reports often reveal patterns that almost no one notices. If this kind of investigation into Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and consciousness interests you, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Here we explore exactly the questions that almost no one dares to ask. And in the next video, we will explore something even more unsettling: how to distinguish a real synchronicity from a simple coincidence of the mind. Because there is one detail in this process that most people never notice,